So welcome everybody to the last webinar of the Association of European Scientists Researchers in Brazil webinar series dedicated to the way the Brazilian academia is working. So the association is an ongoing project for 1 year, more or less, supported by EURAXESS. The objective of the association is to create a network of European scientists working in Brazil to share experience, to create a community among us, basically organized around 3 sections. The first, try to connect and integrate European researchers moving to Brazil. The second one are for researchers already based in Brazil and who are interested in stimulating partnerships with Europe, sharing experience about how you can submit proposals, getting grants, stuff like that. And the third section is dealing with intercultural issues. So we recently organized our first coffee ou bate papo some weeks ago, joining European researchers to talk and to share experience, and we are probably going to organize new sessions in the next months. You can join us on our LinkedIn page. Just have to put Association of European Researchers in Brazil. You will find the first edition of our newsletter as well, summarizing the last activities, sharing news from Europe, and upcoming events and goals. And I will now give the floor to the first speaker of today. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Klaus Capelle. Klaus is a German national, got a MA and PhD in physics across the US and Germany. He spent some time at the USP San Carlos as a postdoc in '98. He was then visiting professor in several universities in Missouri, Bristol, Lund in Sweden, the Freie Universität Berlin in Germany. He got a professor position at USP in 2003, and then at the UFABC, the Federal University of ABC, in 2009. Between 2010 and 2014, he was VP of research for the university, and more recently, between 2014 and 18, he was rector president of the UFABC Federal University. So, Klaus, thanks a lot to be here today, and I will give you the floor right now.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. I'm now going to share my screen. And here we go. Good. So I hope my screen is being shared. If that is not the case, okay, very good. So I would start by saying welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever your time zone is. I hope you're going to have a good time in the seminar. I would also like to express my thanks to the organizers for the invitation, and to state from the beginning how important I consider this kind of initiative. Actually, I would have loved to participate in this kind of initiative 24 years ago when I first came to Brazil. Time passes quickly indeed. Now, I'm going to introduce our seminar, the subject of our seminar today, by giving you lots of data. There's going to be lots of numbers in my slides, but don't try to memorize all these numbers. I'm a number guy. But the important thing are not the numbers, but the overall picture. So, as a matter of fact, numbers and abbreviations abound in the Brazilian academic system. So if you just look at the way I identified my own affiliation here, it's a lot of numbers, UFABC and UFRN. This soup of letters may look like a complete mystery to a reader from outside Brazil, but it actually carries an enormous amount of information for the Brazilian reader. Someone who is familiar with the Brazilian academic system, just by looking at these letters, will know a lot about me, about my work, and the institutions I work at. And I'm going to show you in part of the next few minutes how to discover the information hidden in this kind of abbreviation. So to begin with, Brazil is an enormous country, a country of continental dimensions. You have a scale here of 1,000 kilometers. And this country is divided in regions, and there is a north and a south. But things are never quite as simple in Brazil as they may appear. Of course, there is no east and no west. Instead, there is a region called center-west, a region called northeast, and southeast. These are the macro regions in Brazil. Within these five macro regions, there are 26 states known as estados and one district known as Distrito Federal, which is where the federal capital, Brasilia, is. I'm going to put the Brazilian expressions from many of the local or technical terms in italics and parentheses after the corresponding English word throughout this talk. So those of you who are not familiarized with it can immediately see what the translation would be. Within these 26 states, there are 5,570 cities, municipios. The total area of Brazil is 8.5 million square kilometers. What does 8.5 million square kilometers mean? Well, to put into perspective, one of the biggest European countries is France, which is a little more than 500,000 square kilometers. So France would actually be about the size of this state in northeastern Brazil, the state of Bahia, which is a very popular tourist destination. Germany, which is a bit smaller, would be about the size of Mato Grosso do Sul in center-western Brazil, which is also a popular tourist destination because of the Pantanal region. So you can see that major European countries are typically of the size of a single Brazilian state. That already tells you a lot about the size and the diversity of Brazil. And these two characteristics, size and diversity, are reflected in the Brazilian academic system. Brazil has more than 200 million inhabitants, 212 million, which is about the combined population of Germany plus France plus Italy plus Switzerland. But differently from these countries, about 40% of the Brazilian population is below the age of 30. About 11% is at the age at which one is typically an undergraduate student at university, which is roughly, I would say, from 18 to 24. So 11% of the entire population is at the undergraduate age. Of course, not 11% are at an undergraduate, are enrolled in undergraduate courses. Now, these 11% are about 23 million people, but only about 4 million are actually at a higher learning institution. Brazil is not a poor country. Brazil has a gross domestic product of about 8.7 trillion reais, which corresponds to about 1.6 trillion US dollars. To put that into perspective, the GDP of Germany is about 6 trillion euro. So Brazil is not a poor country. It's poorer than most European countries, but it's not a poor country. The problem is much more the distribution of wealth than the existence of wealth. Brazil is actually one of the richest countries in Latin America. So, well, all of these people, of course, inhabit this immense territory, and Brazil is struggling to offer quality education to all of these. So I'm going to show you now a few numbers, and particularly on the Brazilian university system. And you will have noticed on the previous slide that I talked about higher learning institutions and not just about universities. And there's a reason for that. Actually, Brazil has a total of almost 2,500 higher learning institutions known as instituições de ensino superior. But not all of these are universities. These institutions can be classified, and actually are classified legally, with regard to their academic qualification. Only about 200 of these qualify as universities and can legally call themselves universidade, which means they have teaching activities on the undergraduate and on the graduate level. They have research activities. There is a professional faculty comprised of full-time PhD professors and researchers. Those are some of the characteristic properties of a university. On the other extreme, there is almost 2,000 so-called faculdades, which are similar, not the identical, but similar to the United States concept of a college, which are mostly dedicated to undergraduate teaching. Some of them do research, some of them do have graduate schools, but typically neither graduate education nor research are priority in a faculdade. They are mostly dedicated to undergraduate teaching, and many of the professors at these institutions do themselves not have a PhD, which is not required legally to be teaching on the undergraduate level in the faculdade in Brazil. There is also an intermediate category known as university centers, which was invented basically as a stage for a faculdade that wants to apply to become a university, that would have to pass through that intermediate step of being a university center. But quite frequently institutions attain that intermediate level and never make it to full university. So currently there are about 300 and a little of these university centers. There's also a much smaller number of technical and professional higher learning institutions. Currently there are 40 of them. Now, this gives you an idea of how the institutions can be classified with respect to their academic activities. A different type of classification of the same 2,457 higher learning institution is with regard to their legal status. Actually, the large majority of them are private institutions. Most of them are for profit, but some of them are non-profits, nevertheless private. And what these typically have in common is that they charge tuition of their students. A much smaller numbers, roughly 300, are public institutions, and these generally do not charge tuition of their students. Being public institutions means they are run by some level of governmental organization in Brazil, and that can in Brazil include both the municipal level. Actually, there are 57 of these public institutions are run by a city universities, for example. 129 are run by the 26 states plus Brasilia, and 118 by the federal government. So there's a double classification of this zoo of Brazilian higher learning institutions with regard to academic qualification and legal status. It's quite important whether for you, if you want to come to Brazil for a PhD, for a postdoc, as a visiting scientist, maybe as a faculty member, or even if you have a Brazilian collaborator in your research, to know what kinds of institution you're dealing with, because there are huge differences among the different institutions in the zoo. However, if you restrict yourself to the 203 universities and to the major federal and state-run institutions, you'll find that at the intersection of these categories, there are currently 69 federal universities and 43 state universities. That's a much smaller number. And if you're at one of these universities, you can be assured that life and work, your academic, your professional activities are organized very much as in a similar European university. Now, I know, of course, there's lots of diversity within European universities. And in the same way, there's lots of diversity between these 69 federal and 43 state universities. But overall, what you can expect at these universities is that faculties have a PhD, Faculty works full-time, faculty is doing research, teaching is organized in graduate and undergraduate schools, and most of the academic disciplines you're familiar from the European or the American university system are represented. If you're at any of the other institutions in this table, this may still be the case. There are excellent research institutions, for example, that are not in this red category, but they are the exception. So it's really important that you look carefully at what kind of institution you are at. Now, these institutions are identified in Brazil by the system of abbreviations, and I'm going to use my own current affiliations as an example. So UFABC and UFRN, after everything I have just told you, you can almost guess what these letters mean and what kind of information they convey. The U in both cases means we are dealing with the university, the highest level of Brazilian higher education institution. These institutions do teaching, research, and outreach, organized in undergraduate and graduate schools. F, federal. This tells you in the first place that this is a public university, which immediately tells you students are not charged tuition, staff, technical staff, and professors are public servants. They are hired through a formalized selection process known as concurso, which can be a little unpleasant, but it's part of the game. And as I said, students do not pay tuition. The remaining letters refer to the geographical localization of the university. RN refers to Rio Grande do Norte state in northeastern Brazil. State letters like RN are typically used for the largest or most traditional university in that particular state. Mostly this is a federal university, but not always. For example, the best known Brazilian university outside Brazil is USP, USP, which is the University of Sao Paulo state, which has the SP for Sao Paulo in its name. ABC tells you that there is no state by the name of ABC. That immediately tells you that this is a more recently created university. And since some of these state letters of SP are already taken, the ABC refers to the particular sub-region within Sao Paulo state, where that university is localized. And it immediately tells you, by not being a state letter, that this is not one of the most traditional or not the largest university in the state. It's probably, and in this case, actually, a more recently founded university. So all of this information, which may seem like a lot, is absolutely obvious to a Brazilian reader as soon as you tell them UFRN or UFABC. This is implicit information, and it's very useful to learn how to read it. Now, these universities offer, as I told you, undergraduate courses in Brazil. Undergraduate courses in Brazil are called graduação. That can give rise to some confusion if you are used to the American terminology, US American terminology. An undergraduate student is an aluno da graduação. A graduate student is an aluno da pós-graduação. I know personally of cases where Brazilian undergraduate students went to the library and came back with a book for American graduate students, confusing graduação with graduate student, and being completely desperate how advanced the American colleagues are. Well, in fact, the undergraduate student ended up taking from the library a book for a graduate student. So that's a common confusion, and be aware of it. Now, the 2004 something higher education institutions I just divided up into categories for you offer almost 42,000 different undergraduate courses. That may seem like a huge number, but everything in Brazil seems like a huge number because the country is so big. If you divide this, you'll find it's just an average of about 7 different courses per higher education institution. And the explanation for that, of course, is that some of the private institutions in particular the private faculties, colleges, offer only a very small number of courses, which are the courses they can make money from. Typically things like computer science, administration, business, and things. Only the big universities offer the full spectrum of academic specialties. Now, I'm not going to discuss in detail all these numbers here. I just want to point out that the majority of these undergraduate courses is presential learning. But even before the COVID pandemic, a substantial number of distance learning courses was established in Brazil. Many things, as you may know, went wrong in Brazil during the pandemic. But the distance learning was a thing in Brazil even before the pandemic, and that has helped with lots of imperfections and problems, but that has helped higher education to better survive the pandemic. So about 6,000 undergraduate courses, full courses, are currently offered on the undergraduate level in Brazil. According to official numbers, more than 8 million students, undergraduate students, are currently enrolled in Brazil, including public and private institutions, including universities and colleges, including presential and distance learning. If you sum all of that, it's supposed to be more than 8 million. That is an official number. In practice, I believe that many of these probably drop out. There's a huge evasion rate in Brazilian undergraduate courses. So at any given moment, I believe it's going to be less than that, but the official number is 8.6 million undergraduate students, which again is a very large number. Going on to graduate courses, of course, the number of graduate courses is much less than undergraduate courses. There are currently about 7,000 master's and PhD level courses in Brazil, 3,000 and something master level courses and 2,400 PhD level courses. If you're quick in math, you'll find that if you add these numbers, the sum does not give 7,000. And the reason is that there's also something called a professional master's and a professional PhD in Brazil, which aim not at younger students, but at people who already have a profession and want to go back to university to further specialize or to grow professionally. If you add these in, you'll end up with a total of 7,000 graduate level courses. Sometimes you find a much higher number than that. And these courses currently accommodate a total of 374,000 graduate students in Brazil. Seems like a large number, but that's only about 4% of the number I just gave you for the undergraduate students. That is a much smaller percentage of graduate to undergraduate students than in the United States or in most European countries. So there's a huge potential in Brazil for growing graduate level education. Sometimes you actually do see a much higher number of students. You sometimes even see a number of 100 or almost 2,000 graduate level courses, but that includes a very large number of so-called specialization courses, which do not lead to a master's or a PhD, but simply to a certificate of specialization. These are courses of typically 360 hours, and they are considered graduate level courses in Brazil because you must have an undergraduate degree to enroll in them, but they are not graduate level courses in the sense of a master or a PhD degree. If you add these, you will actually find the number, which is sometimes given prominence by official statements, that Brazil has more than 1 million graduate students, which is a fairly impressive number. But the actual number on master's and PhD level graduate students is only about 1/3 of that. And of this 1/3, Another third is at private universities, about 2/3 is at public universities. If you remember from a previous slide that the largest number of higher education institutions is private and only the minority is public, you see that this disparity becomes even bigger. Right? The specialization courses, as I alluded to previously, also typically operate in fields like administration, business, and technology. So they do not offer all fields of academic specialization we are used to. Right. Now, as I told you, when you are at one of the major federal universities or major state-owned universities, you can expect your life to be organized in a fairly similar way to as it would be at a similar European institution. In particular, it means you'll have to go after funding and you'll be evaluated. So I'll end by saying a few words about these two aspects of academic life in Brazil. There are several funding agencies, and before the current economic and political crisis in Brazil, the system of funding agencies in Brazil was working actually very well. Currently, they are unfortunately very underfunded. There is actually a network of federal agencies specializing in the case of CAPES at graduate studies and scholarship, in the case of CNPq at research, and in the case of FINEP at industrial research and innovation, infrastructure. And there are also state agencies, collectively known as FAPES, Fundação de Amparo à Pesquisa, which, as you can probably guess by now, have a name that identifies their nature as a state agency and letters identifying the state. FAPESP, for example, being the agency of São Paulo's state, FAPERJ of Rio de Janeiro state. The whole network of funding agencies in Brazil is fairly sophisticated and quite well organized. Unfortunately, over the last few years, they have all become grotesquely underfunded. Now, the other aspect which is common to almost all Brazilian institutions and Europeans is evaluation and ranking. Actually, this is also a system that works quite well in Brazil. One could even say it works too well because we are obliged to spend so much of our time to contribute to evaluation and ranking systems that sometimes it takes away time we would much rather spend on research or teaching. But anyway, there are several institutions dealing with evaluation and ranking of Brazilian universities on the undergrad level, on the graduate level, and on the level of entire universities. They have an enormous number of indicators, periodicities, and metrics. I'm not going to discuss all of these, which is really a subject for an entire lecture. But as a general guide, higher numbers are better, which may be a surprise if you're used, for example, to the German academic system where lower numbers are better. In Brazil, as in many other countries, larger numbers are better. Undergraduate courses are typically ranked from 1 to 5, graduate courses from 1 to 7, universities again from 1 to 7. But the most important thing for your daily life is when you become a professor at a Brazilian university, you'll periodically be asked to provide all of your productivity data and all of your activities in excruciating detail to university management, because all of it will be used to evaluate you within your department within the university, your course within the overall scheme of graduate and undergraduate courses, and your university within the overall academic system of Brazil. So evaluation is a big thing in Brazil, and you'll definitely see that happening even if you only visit Brazil. Many of the institutions use selected results of these evaluation as part of their marketing, in particular private universities who are using that to attract students because they are paid by the students. For them, getting good grades is quite important because it becomes a matter of financial sustainability. but even public universities use these rankings and metrics and evaluations because it's an important part of their scientific and academic reputation. So to end, after everything I have told you, you may ask yourself, good, but how do I actually find out if my collaborator at a given university, if the job offer at a given university, if my future postdoc at a given university, what kind of university is that I'm dealing with? There is an official system that provides all the answers, and I have just given you basically a tutorial in how to use it. You basically go to the website of EMAC, which is up here in my slide, which is a national register of all courses and all institutions of higher education within Brazil. And again, it works quite well, although it can be a little painful to use it in practice. You'll find a searchable interface, and you can look for, specify whether you're looking for an entire institution, for an undergraduate course, for a specialization course. Graduate courses are not in this system. There's a different system run by COPPUS for that. You can specify the state, the city, the administrative category, the legal category. And when you specify all that, you'll be, there is a search button, and you'll get all the information which I just explained to you how to use and how to read on a Brazilian university. So this is a very useful system, and whatever your interest in a Brazilian university, be it as a student, as a collaborator, or as for a visiting fellowship or as a job opportunity, this should be a starting point to learn about the institution you'll be dealing with. So that's basically what ends my overview, and I'm here to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks a lot, Klaus. It was an amazing overview of a broad, really huge country and a lot of acronyms that we're using on an everyday basis in the Brazilian university system. So I will now give the floor to Nicolas Maillard before opening to the Q&A afterwards. So Nicolas is a French national, he's a computer scientist, currently professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul and Porto Alegre. He's former Dean of International Affairs of this university and is the current head of the ILEA, the Latin American Institute for Advanced Studies. So Nicolas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sebastian. So I will start again exactly where Professor Capelle stopped, with first a broad overview again of the higher education system in Brazil, and then I'll try to focus on the level of the university to give you an idea of what it really means to work as a professor in Brazil. So I won't take too much time on the overall data. By coincidence, Professor Capelle mentioned, he gave the numbers regarding the size of the country of Brazil with respect to France, while I had a slide where I had projected on the same scale both countries. So as he mentioned, you can see, you can have an idea of the size of the country, which of course means that at whatever level you may think about Brazil, it's a heterogeneous country. It's very hard to give a general trend in Brazil. You always have to bear in mind that what happens in Manaus is probably very different from what happens in extreme South Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, to mention the state where I live and work. So please bear in mind that everything that we can tell you based on one given example may not apply to somewhere else in Brazil. I also had some information regarding the organization of higher education in Brazil. Of course, I won't repeat everything that Professor Capelle mentioned and explained very well. I just wanted to highlight here the importance for a European wishing to work in Brazil of this accreditation process by the Ministry of Education, by MEC, because of all those indicators indicators we gather on our universities because of all this evaluation process, which is constantly applied in Brazil. For whoever is interested in getting data regarding the higher education in Brazil, you have many information available online. You can even see the salary, for instance, of every federal servant and every federal professor if you want to. You can see which courses are given by whom in Brazil. We have a national database of CVs, which is also very important to get whatever information you want regarding our work. If you look up my name, you'll certainly find my CV by the Brazilian standards. So you can see my publications, you can see whatever you want. So it's important to bear this in mind. If you compare with some other countries in Latin America, like Mexico or Colombia, where not all the degrees, not all the higher education institutions are controlled and accredited by a central agency, by a central ministry, while we are in a very different situation in Brazil. You can have a very strong information, strong background on our universities accessing the IMEC or the URL, which stands in this slide here. The numbers regarding the universities are those that Professor Capella mentioned. They all come from the national census on higher education. So again, if you want to have even much more detail on these figures, you can find them online. Here you have some other representation of the way our students, our undergraduate students, are distributed among those higher education institutions in Brazil. It's important to understand that you can count or you can categorize the universities regarding their status, their legal status, or regarding the number of students they have, and you end up with different representations. If you look at the numbers of students, of undergraduate students, you can see that they really concentrate at 78% in private institutions, both profits or non-profits. The federal universities, which are by many criteria very important, some would say the most important universities in Brazil, and the state universities, which are also very strong in research typically, together they gather only 21% of the undergraduate students. So as you can see in Brazil, the mass of undergraduate students is really concentrated in private institutions, whether they are universities or not. You can also differentiate the kind of degrees that our undergraduate students get in our Brazilian universities or higher education institutions. We have roughly three kinds of degree: a bacharelado, which is typically a 9 semester to 10 semesters degree. We have licenciatura, not to be confused with the same term used in Portugal or even in France. A licenciatura in Brazil is a degree which enables someone to be a secondary teacher. So you have an academic degree mixing didactics, pedagogy, and a specific field of knowledge to become then a teacher at school or at high school. Then you also have technologus, technical degrees for technical professions. And as you can see, 64% of our students are enrolled in bacharelados, in bachelors in Brazil. So it's this second criteria is also another way to analyze what a given university or faculty is doing, depending on the kind of degree they're issuing. Of course, you will have a different profile of students and of professors. Regarding graduate studies, again, Professor Capella gave some very interesting numbers. Here, I got a presentation from a journal published from in the state of Sao Paulo regarding the number of PhDs which were delivered each here starting in 1996, and you see where we have roughly 24,000 PhD awarded those last years. It's also interesting to see that many women here in Brazil get PhD. Actually, more than half of our PhDs are women, so it's quite a fair amount of female doctors that we have in Brazil. As mentioned by Professor Capella, the number of PhD and master students we have in Brazil could be higher, should be higher by many standards. Still, it's important to know that in Latin America, we are certainly the country with the strongest graduate degrees and the highest number of graduate students. This is a very clear difference of the Brazilian academy with regards to the rest of Latin America. The geographical distribution of those universities, of those higher education institutions is, as always in Brazil, concentrated on the shore and on the south and southeast regions. As you can see in Amazonas, in the remote parts of the country, you have way less higher education institutions than in the East, which is of course very important for many reasons. First, if you're looking for a position, usually you have a lot of opportunities in remoter parts of the country because we need to develop more higher education in the farthest states of Brazil. So usually we have positions opening and less candidates willing to get there. So it might be strategical to aim for a position in a remoter part of the country. The competition will be probably less intense. It's important to know that the previous governments have created new universities, have opened new positions in our universities to expand the higher education system at the scale of the country. So we do have opportunities for new professors and for foreign professors when they want to look for them. Now, what I really wanted to focus on here are what is called in Brazil the three missions of the university. The three missions, as they are stated in the constitution, in the Brazilian constitutions, are teaching, research, and so far there shouldn't be no surprise for our audience. I think as European researchers, you are quite used to universities doing teaching and research. What is different in Brazil is a third mission, which we call in Portuguese extensão, extension, outreach. In Europe, sometimes people do use the term the third mission of the university. It's a mix of social, cultural, health-related maybe activities, whatever activity which establishes the bridge between the academy and the society as a whole. Either in an outbound way, the universities export towards the civil society their knowledge, their practices, either in the other way, either importing inside the university traditional knowledges, non-academic knowledges, non-academic practices, which the society develops so that the academy is not closed from the world inside which it lives. So it's really, outreach is really both ways. We need to interact with the society, to learn with the society, and to teach the society what we can do. So it's important to understand that as a professor in a Brazilian university, you are expected to work on those three kinds of activities. Of course, each one of us as professor can specialize or give a more important weight to some given activity. Maybe some of us do more research than outreach and extension. But on the whole, on average, we are really evaluated, forced, and our universities have to perform the three activities, and there shouldn't even be an imbalance. The three activities, the three missions are as important as the other ones. So nobody can be only a researcher in a Brazilian university. We have to teach and we have to do extension as well. The structure of the university, of course, again, it depends from each place actually, but roughly in pretty much all universities and certainly in federal universities, you will find a structure which is organized more or less as I put it on this slide. On the top left, you can see what I call the executive power, the management of the university. We have a rector, a president, a vice rector or vice president, and usually in Brazil, you only have one vice rector, vice president. The idea is that the vice rector is really a substitute for the rector in charge when the rector, for instance, travels abroad. So both share the overall responsibility of managing the university. They have a whole team of proreitores, which in Europe usually would be called vice presidents. And each one of the proreitor is in charge of one big area of the university. So you will have one proreitor for undergraduate studies, for graduation as we call it. You will have a proreitor for graduate studies. We will have a proreitor of research, like Professor Capella used to be 10 years ago, and so on and so forth. And as you can see, you will have a proreitor of research, a proreitor of undergraduate studies, but you will have also a proreitor of extension, of extinction, who will have an important role in the administration of the university. Then, besides this executive power, you will have a legislative body, a council, typically a university council, which sometimes is translated as a board. It's not really a board as they use the term in the USA or maybe in the United Kingdom. It's really a body, an electoral body of representatives from the academic community. And this council is a council together with the other specialist bodies. For instance, you may have a specific council for undergraduate studies and for research and so forth. So each one of those councils, they really decide, they vote on the bylaws, on the regiment of the university. They are the ones who decide what the university is going to do and how it's going to work. And the executive power has to do what those councils decide. So it's just like a government of a country. You have the ministries, the executive power, and the legislative body, which decides for the academic world. Then, of course, besides or below or above, in some sense, those management structures, you have the academic units, the faculties. So again, there's a whole galaxy, a whole hierarchy of institutes, of departments, of faculties, but roughly for each given field of knowledge, you will have a structure which is responsible for the teaching, the research, and the outreach activities. That's how we are structured. And as a professor, you have to be hired to work inside one of those academic departments, and you report to the head of this department and to the different proreitorias, which tell you how you have to work, basically. Regarding teaching, it's important to know that the organization of our degrees is slightly different from the organization in Europe. In Europe, you have a 3-year cycle giving you a first degree, then a 2-year cycle giving you a master's degree, then a 3-year cycle roughly, which gives you a PhD. The exact length of the PhD actually varies from one European country to the other, but roughly the basic idea from the Bologna process was to have cycles synchronized after 2 and 3 years. In Brazil, it's different. Mostly because, as you can see on the left on this diagram here, before entering into the university, people can start their university actually younger than in Europe. So this also means that probably need some more time in Brazil to have people graduating having as much knowledge as in Europe. So typically our undergraduate studies last 9 semesters, maybe 10 semesters, which means 5 years. So it's much longer than the 3 years in Europe. Then we'll have a mestrado, a master degree, which also will last 2 years. Then a PhD or doctorado, which lasts usually 4 whole years. So the university lasts actually more time in Brazil than in Europe. And well, as a professor, it means that you have to teach or to supervise students during more time as well. Our teaching at undergraduate level and at the grad level is organized in semesters, not a whole year. And each semester, roughly the same courses are repeated. You may have some alternation, maybe one given course will be offered one every 2 semesters, but on the other, you repeat your classes from one semester to the other. Typically for teaching, at least in a federal university, you are required to give 8 to 12 hours of class by week during one semester of 15 weeks. So 4, maybe 5 months, during 4 or 5 months, you have to give those 8 to 12 hours of teaching time per week. The exact distribution varies from one university to the other. For instance, in my university, in my department actually, because it also varies from one department to the other, we only give 8 hours, and we have the choice between giving 8 hours of classes only at the undergraduate level or 4 hours at the undergraduate level plus 4 hours at the graduate levels. In Brazil, this means a relatively small amount of time dedicated to teaching. In private institutions, in private universities, usually professors in Brazil are meant to give up to 16, maybe 20 hours of time to the classrooms. So in those federal universities, which research-oriented university, we do have some time to do other things than teaching. Of course, the second activities that is interesting for our audience here is research. The research activity, I would say, is quite similar to what we can find in Europe. Again, you have those national agencies which we have to apply to get money, to get funding to fund our research, which means that an important part of our research time is actually dedicated to writing projects, submitting projects, evaluating the projects of other colleagues, and managing the money and the funds which comes from our national or state agencies. And of course, inside research, we also have a lot of time to dedicate to student advising, teaching at the graduate level. In Brazil, research is very much connected to graduate studies. So we are both researchers and teachers of younger researchers in Brazil. Finally, and I'm almost done with my time here, again, I wanted to emphasize the importance of outreach, extension in Brazil. It is something that as a professor, we can't ignore. We have to do this. And it's even more important now that for the last couple of years, outreach activities have been integrated into the curricula of our undergraduate students. So our students do need to get credits for those activities, which means that our students need that their professors monitor, advise them, organize those outreach activities. So I don't know if you're a student in a vet school, for instance, you may have to develop projects to offer veterinary services for the pets of a poorer neighborhood. Or if you're a student in sports, in physical activities, you may organize some classes for elderly people. You have lots of ideas of social activities, cultural activities. We have a planetarium, for instance. So in my university, so our students of astrophysics, they do receive the public in general in this planetarium to explain to the audience how the stars are visible in our state. So those activities, they really take time, and it's time which is also necessary from the professor besides research and besides teaching. There is possibly an overlap with research in many social sciences, for instance. These outreach activities are also the basis of research, so you can actually combine research and extension, but you have to be aware that in Brazil you have to work on those three activities. And I think that's more or less what I wanted to say today. A few references here if you want to access some websites to get some more information regarding our universities. Sébastien, I'm done.
Thanks a lot, Nicolas. It was a great overview of the three missions of the university. I mean, each country has a way to deal with those three big parts of our everyday life as scientists, teachers, and extension workers, if you mean. So it was quite great. We have the Q&A open now. So if you want to ask questions to our two speakers today, you can just type them in your Q&A, the Q&A of the Zoom call here. You can also ask question Nicolas to close to Nicolas, but I have prepared some of them as well. So I will start with a question about the CAPES evaluation process. I thought interesting that both Klaus and Nicolas you talk about that. Connie McManus mentioned that at the first webinar, the keynote, and she had a slide with a skeleton in the closet when she spoke about the evaluation process. And we just had the new grades of the graduate program that were published by CAPES. So perhaps you could explain a bit more to a European Union audience how this ranking and evaluation is working in Brazil, especially considering the last agreement on reforming research assessment in Europe, which just went published, which explicitly prohibit ranking of research centers in Europe, and which strongly encourage qualitative assessment based on peer review instead of relying exclusively of quantitative or productivist indices. So can you explain a bit how it's working in Brazil now, and how we can understand the contrast with the trends we are seeing in Europe currently? Thanks.
Well, I can start on that, and then Nicolas can complete. Is that okay? You're referring in particular to the CAPES evaluation, and CAPES evaluates graduate level courses. So that's different from the INAPE evaluation, which is undergraduate level. For these graduate level courses, what CAPES takes into account is mostly the productivity of the researchers. So they look a lot at published papers, invitation to international conferences, participation at conferences. They also look at how many master's and PhD degrees are given by the course in a given period of time. They look at the proportion of the number of students and number of professors, the number of dropouts, people who do not get the desired degree. So there are lots of criteria. But overall, the most important is scientific productivity, I would say. And the result of this evaluation, which is performed periodically every few years, is very important because it does not only determine the academic reputation, but also a large part of the funding of each graduate level course. These courses receive funding from within university, but they also receive money from CAPES, directly from CAPES. And depending on what grade you get in this evaluation, you will get no money from CAPES, a little bit money, or lots of money from CAPES. So it's really important for the funding, and it's really important also for the number of scholarships you can give, because depending on the level of evaluation you attain, the course can give away master's and PhD level scholarships just as a very small funding agency would. And the number of scholarships the course can give also depends on the grade. And even the degree of academic autonomy depends on the grade. a very highly evaluated course can take much more internal decisions without having to consult CAPES, while a badly evaluated course has to ask for permission for many more administrative and academic small decisions.
Thanks. Nicola, do you have something on that?
Well, just to comment slightly regarding the last part of your question, Sebastian, there is clearly a difference of approach regarding evaluation as a whole between the Brazilian academy and Europe. It's a very complex story. First, in Brazil, as Professor Capelli mentioned before, we are really very zealous regarding evaluation. For bad reasons, but also for good reasons. It's also a question of transparency. There's a lot of public money put on the table to fund our universities and our researchers. So it's also quite normal and quite sound, actually, that we assess how much this money is used and how good it is used and what kind of outcomes it enables. The society, or the Brazilian society, needs to be as sure as possible that as researchers we are doing something with the money. So I think it's all this grading and this ranking is also important for this reason in a society, of course, where there's a lot of suspicion regarding corruption and poor use of the funding. So we can disagree regarding an excess of ranking and bureaucracy, but on the other hand, we really have to accept also the necessity of those indicators, or at least part of them. Now, regarding specifically the evaluation of research and publications and so on, I think there is a consensus that we went too far and that our CVs are too detailed. CAPES until 2020, I think, was quite aware that they had to simplify the assessment because the national bodies weren't able anymore to gather that much information to process it. Basically, every researcher is evaluating all of the researchers. It's quite complex and too much. So we had started a motion to simplify things. Now, without entering into political debates, it's also well, CAPES has been through lots of changes those last years. It's also very complicated to define a consensus regarding how much you can change previous evaluation processes. The evaluation processes are long processes. We're talking about a 4 years gathering of indicators, so you can't simply change it from one day to the other. So, well, it's different from what happens in Europe. The current evaluation process has clear limitations and shortcomings. I think at some point we'll change this to have something simpler and broader. Typically, instead of evaluating all of our publications, maybe we'll start evaluating the 5 top publications of a given researchers. But it takes time to adapt this kind of procedures.
Thanks. Now, it's a fascinating dive in the way things are working in Brazil. And even in Europe, we have quite differences between countries. Even after 20 years of the Bologna process, national discrepancy are quite important. And building those dialogues even between Brazil and Europe, between countries in Europe, is quite important. I had a second question, because we don't have anything in the Q&A. You mentioned both the way the graduate level, post-graduation no Brazil, is organized, linking quite deeply research and teaching. And so could you explain a bit more, how does it working? How a research group is usually working in Brazil? What is the kind of culture of supervision or orientation that you have, of mentoring that you have at this level? Is there a difference between departments, universities, or even region in the countries? Knowing that it's something that probable PhD students or postdoc will experiment when they arrived here.
Well, I can start. Do you want to start, Michael? I can start on that then. The research group is typically not a formalized part of the organization of a university in the same sense as a department or an institute or some other formal subdivision. A research group is much more an association of people. It can be a single professor and his or her students, can also be a group of professors working on a similar subject, but it's much more an association of people who voluntarily collaborate on a given scientific subject. There is something called the Directorate of Research Groups in Brazil, which is run by CNPq, the other of the two main federal funding agencies. We were talking about CAPES, now this is CNPq. But this list of research group has never attained a high degree of formality and is not really such a decisive thing in day-to-day work. So the research group is mostly a less formal association of people. However, it is in the groups where most research and certainly all of master's and PhD level research actually happens. So it's less formal, but extremely important in practice.
Yeah, I would say on my side, I think research and advising in Brazil are much more personalized, much more individualized maybe than they are in at least those European countries I know. Maybe because historically speaking, this higher number of doctors that we have is something relatively recent. So I think we are still working as in a previous time of the Brazilian science, where there were less top-level scientists. Let's put it this way. So it's probably more individualized than in Europe. Also because the funding we get is usually given on a shorter time than in Europe. We are talking about getting funds to work on a given research project during 2 years, maybe 3 years, not much more than this. So it also leads to a very individualized research group and mentoring process regarding the students. Sebastian, if you give me one more minute, I need to add something which I should have mentioned. I talked about departments and the organization of the university. I also mentioned that we have some younger universities in Brazil. It's important for people to know that some universities have been created on a different basis than the oldest universities, and specifically regarding departments. You take a university like UFABC, for instance, Professor Capelle's university. They are quite famous in Brazil for having been built with a transdisciplinary view and a trans-departmental view. So you certainly find some universities which are much more flexible in terms of organization of the teaching activities, so that a given teacher may intervene in more than one degrees. So as I was saying at the beginning of my talk, it really depends a lot on each given university.
Well, thank you so much for you defending my institution, but very good point. UFABC was precisely created as a model of a university without departments in order to stimulate interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary teaching. And another characteristic is that all students enter university by means of an interdisciplinary bachelor's degree in science and technology or science and humanities. And further specialization takes only place years later as students are already at university. So that's an experiment that was performed in Brazil some 15 years ago. And the numbers today show it's working. UFABC is quite successful, but it's by far not typical of Brazilian universities. Thank you.
Thanks, Klaus. Thanks, Nicolas, for this insight. We reached the end of the webinar, so perhaps if you have a last comment, last consideration you want to share, feel free to do it now before I close it.
Well, I think everybody in Europe willing to work as a researcher or as a professor should be really should take a serious look. We do have very interesting opportunities in our universities, even if they're different from their European counterparts. They do offer some very interesting perspectives to work and to do research. So if you're interested, feel free to contact us to get some more information, and please visit us.
Well, exactly. That is a wonderful way of summarizing it. You can do world-class research in Brazil, and you can also meet some very nice, interesting people and have a happy life within and outside academia in Brazil. It's worthwhile thinking about coming.
Thanks a lot. This is confirming my own experience. Now we are from all over Brazil. Nicolas is on the south of Brazil. Klaus is in the center in São Paulo. I'm in the northeast of Brazil. So this reality is quite shared. Thanks you all for your contribution, for the public as well. You can still be part of the association if you are a European researcher in Brazil. You can find our webpage on the EURAXESS website and fill in the formula to be advised of our activities. You can also follow our daily life and publication, our LinkedIn page. And lastly, you will be able to follow next activities like the next Bate Papo, next cafe that we want to organize to stimulate networking between European scientists in Brazil. Thanks a lot and have a good afternoon.